Welcome to the 2021 Scottish International Film Education Conference, which is obviously online. We're delighted to have you all with us. Thank you all for being willing to engage with yet another Zoom conference. We've got a really great series of events over the next 2 days. Please do check out the rest of our program, along with this morning's papers from the Film Education Journal events, where some of our current and also future authors will be presenting short papers of their work. This conference is obviously is partnered with the Film Education Journal, and today we are launching our newest edition of the Film Education Journal, which I'll maybe ask my colleague Flip just to share a link to in the comments. The Film Education Journal is entirely open access and online, so it's free to read. Our new edition is one of our best yet, I think. We have a series of international perspectives on film education, including from Professor Jyoti Mistry on decolonizing film education, which was our keynote last year, which Jyoti has now written up into a submission for the journal. So please do check out that new edition of the journal, and please consider submitting to us. We're always delighted to receive submissions to the journal. And particularly as the journal is kind of growing, it's wonderful to see the number of the diversity of submissions that we're getting in, both kind of in terms of their subject matter and also where they're coming from internationally. So yes, please do reach out and consider making a submission. Alongside our journal, we also have a series of resources for teachers, which I'll also ask my colleague Flip to share. So if you're a teacher that's joining us today, and you're interested in how might some of our research in the Film Education Journal be relevant to you in the classroom, we have a series of resources that we've kind of built around some of the articles, to help you think about how you might be able to use some of the research in these papers in the classroom. So please do check that out, series of free resources. And finally, I should just say just a few quick words of thanks, especially to our funders at Screen Scotland, to Scott and Gail. We're very grateful for your continued support that allows us to be here today and enables the ambition of both our conference and also the journal. I'd like to thank our publishers at UCL, IOE Press, and in particular Pat Gordon-Smith for her continued commitment and diligence. I'd like to thank my co-editors at the Film Education Journal, Robert Monroe, Mark Reed, and Andrew Byrne, for their continued support and comradeship. And most of all, I'd like to thank our wonderful administrator, Flip, who thanks to whom Flip's the one that keeps things running, I think. So thank you so much, Flip, for all your amazing efforts. You're very much appreciated. And so just before I hand over to our host for this morning's panel, Mark Reed, I just want to kind of reiterate, please do consider submitting something to us at the Film Education Journal. We are very interested in hearing what you're doing, whether it's in the classroom, whether it's outside the classroom, and particularly interested in international perspectives upon film education. If you've got an idea that you think might somehow kind of lead to an article, please do reach out and we can kind of give you some feedback. We're always happy to hear from people. So yeah, please do reach out. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And I'm going to now hand over to my colleague, Mark Reed, who will be hosting this morning's session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jamie. Hello, everybody. Lovely to be here. My name's Mark Reed and I work at the British Film Institute in the Education Department and have done for quite a long time. I'm really pleased to be involved with the journal and also to be chairing a panel for presentations of authors to papers at the journal, which I've read beforehand because I'm on the reviewing panel. So these are, I think these are very, each in their way, are very distinctive perspectives on aspects of film education, which I think it's really important that we get more, a greater airing. So I'm going to introduce the speakers in a minute. There's just a couple of housekeeping things. We're being recorded. You will have seen that. You will have had that kind of doom-laden announcement from the Zoom voice. This session is being recorded. So as long as everybody's aware of that, it's also being live captioned, and I think you've got the live captioning link in the chat. if you want to click on that, then you can get to read as well as hear, as well as listen, as well as watch. And we are going to have an option for Q&A, and the kind of protocol with the webinar is that you don't put stuff in the chat. You put a question in the Q&A section, or you raise your hand when it comes to Q&A, and then somebody will kind of spot you and get a question going. It's a 90-minute session, I think, or maybe a little bit more if we really get steamed up. 3 50-minute presentations, and then about the equivalent time for conversation afterwards. So our speakers in order of presentation are Chris Nunn, who's program director, program leader for the BA Film and TV production at Greenwich University, and he's going to be talking about, I guess I'm thinking of it as the kind of the turn to industry in film education policy, which my kind of professional biography is intertwined with. So I'm interested in this notion anyway. Just having it from a different perspective, somebody looking at this, how the kind of the story, the narrative of film education policy over the last 15 years or so. And then Rebecca McShaffrey, who is the Learning and Youth Engagement Manager at Glasgow Film Theatre, who's going to share with us perspectives from young people about their aspirations in working in the creative industries and working particularly in the screen industries. And this is a fantastic piece of work, which I think is notable for the freshness of the voices of young people talking about the way they see their careers, their lives, their aspirations, and which is really rare. And I think, for that alone is really is worth reading. And then Ryan Shand, Dr. Ryan Shand, who's research fellow at Ravensbourne University London, who's coined this phrase "small gauge storytelling." Is that your phrase, Ryan? But making a link between the user-generated content, I think it used to be called, created by young people, and putting that in the history and the tradition of amateur filmmaking, which I think is also really, interesting and distinctive kind of perspective on young people's work. So we've got slides, we've got presentations, we're going to see a little bit of film at some point, which is always important in a film education conference. I'm going to hand over to Chris as our first speaker. There you go. Over to you, Chris.
Lovely. Thanks very much for that, Mark. I'm just going to share my desktop and hope that people can see it. How are we doing? Everyone can see that? Yeah, fabulous. Thanks very much. Yes, so sadly, no film in my presentation, but as Mark has said, I'm here to talk about filmmaking education for all, so looking at British cultural policy in film education, which I hope is going to be a little bit more interesting than that title kind of makes it sound. But it might be the longest 15 minutes of your life, but let's see how we go. So yes, the paper looked at the discourse of public film education policy documents in the UK from 1999 to 2017, and really there are 3 core papers in this period that are what I've called below high advocacy, and by that we mean that multiple groups, the British Film Institute is one of them, but multiple groups were involved in the kind of putting together and publication of these policy documents. So at various points you've got creative skill set, now screen skills, you've got the BBC, you've got Channel 4. So there's a number of different, BAFTA, I believe, in at least one of these, the UK Film Council, who've now gone. But so you get this sense that everyone's trying to come together and put together some kind of overarching systemic filmmaking education. 2 of these major reports then had kind of critical follow-ups. So I had a look at those as well, kind of 7 years later, roughly, having a look at what had or had not been achieved by the initial paper. And then really the paper is a critical reflection, I suppose, on the discourse that these documents taken together, the story that they tell, and Mark is quite correct that really you see a shift towards industry, actually, if you look at all these various reports in succession. And while the bulk of what I do here is quite critical, I think it's very important to look at successful examples of film education policy intervention, lesser known, but nevertheless they've possibly had more of a concrete effect on the way that film education is run in this country. So the three key papers are Making Movies Matter back in 1999. I think that was a seminal paper. I still think some of the ideas presented in that report are really fundamental to where we are today. That was followed up with Film, a 21st Century Literacy in 2008, published by the UK Film Council, but nevertheless still a very collaborative effort. And Film Skills and Action Plan is probably, that's the lovely image here, but it's probably one of the more recent documents in that regard. And again, a collaborative effort. What you'll note, obviously, if you're looking at the dates as well, you know, anyone who works in a university will be very familiar with strategy refreshes. So this should look the same to you, which is that we kind of, each report has a life cycle where it turns up and a lot of noise is made, and I imagine people gather in a room and drink some Prosecco. And then, you know, the report goes out, people try and action some of the points, and then it kind of drifts into the background, and then new people arrive and think, oh, we need a new report. So I think that's possibly some of the ways in which this plays out. They have a life cycle, these things. Yeah, and the focus on these really is broad public access to film education, and the need for a systemic film education, perhaps even standards that we could share across, and they don't quite exist. The narrative, even as early as Making Movies Matter in 1999, is that, you know, to participate in 21st century life, children really need to understand the moving image. And I think while that's probably changed a bit certainly since 1999, I think it's still something we should possibly have our eye on. And then the questions become, well, how specialized should such an education be? Is it about kind of film appreciation? Is it about film criticism? Is it about film practice, which I think increasingly it is, and even Making Movies Matter made kind of reference to the need for students to have, I think, what they called production competence. So these are some of the issues that come out if you look at all these reports. So some quotes from them that I think are really important, and these are some of the ones that are in the paper as well as published. An acknowledgement by the authors of Making Movies Matter that film education in the UK has developed in bits and pieces. You know, the film studies angle kind of comes out of that English literature tradition of analysing texts, and the filmmaking really in the UK comes out of art schools, actually, I think. But then when you move it into kind of polytechnic colleges and then universities, there's some interesting trajectories, but I think everyone's working on their own bit. And so that's something that they wanted consistent standards. And I would still argue that sort of 20 years later, we're still looking for that. And this mission statement, I think, from the authors of this report is possibly the most important, which is this idea that film is more than an industry. You know, I think more contemporary iterations of this would make us think that film is only an industry. And indeed, you know, higher education courses are very much a part of this narrative as well. So I don't think it just exists here. So you have this, but more than a collection of commodities and a vehicle for stars, I think is a nice mission statement, something we may have lost and something we might want to come back to, actually. Then you get Film, a 21st Century Literacy, you know, and again, these kind of bold statements about the need for young people to understand cameras and keyboards, or to understand certainly how the moving image works. I think that's probably more important today than it was when it was first published. Noting that, of course, how we're producing that moving image work has changed. So, you know, we mentioned specific cameras. I'm not sure it's about that, but I think it is about understanding how that kind of visual communication works. So a good, a laudable aim. We're going down the route of justifying film as an essential literacy. And I think it's important to point out, and I'll conclude with this, but the literacy, the kind of digital literacy angle, is how the BFI and Northern Ireland Screen were able to get a GCSE in moving image arts published. sort of published, brought online in Northern Ireland. So I think it's important to see that this has some relevance, really. And again, an acknowledgement here that film education is inconsistent and perhaps still a bonus for some lucky children. Again, I would suggest we're probably still in that realm today, perhaps not quite as severely, but we're still around there. And then we have critical follow-ups to both of these was Carrie Bazalgette's Making Movies Matter. So seven years later, kind of having a look at it. And I think a really important document actually is Redefining Film Education, which is a kind of transcript of a symposium that's held at the BFI in 2013. Mainly because of the number of people who were at that from different areas of film education. I think that's what made that quite valuable. So Bazalgette points out that while it was an overarching policy paper, many of the recommendations were actually left to each organization to implement themselves. And each of those is subject to their own needs and wants and funding restrictions. And, and so basically it wasn't done at a high enough level or implemented there. And I think this is still very much a problem, that this is being done, it's being left to all of us, and I include higher education in this, to kind of put these things together from our own standpoints. And we all know that there are immense pressures on each of our organizations at any given time. So it's quite difficult really in that context. And then she criticizes, and I think this is correct, high profile initiatives, high advocacy reports, because they make a lot of noise, but do they actually themselves contribute to sustainable change? And I think that's a big question that we collectively should be asking as we try and move forward and think about what our next policy initiative might be and who might be involved in it. So again, there's some critical voices in here. The educators gathered were from media and film studies, A-level, they were from schools, there were academics there, and there were people from the various screen agencies as well. And I think that then allows a comment like this to come to the fore, really. The complexity is everyone's coming at it from a different angle. And that means that defining film education actually is one of the big challenges we have. And I would argue we still have that problem today. And then the acknowledgement, and again, this is something that you'd feel maybe reading the cycle of these reports, but it's also something that you might feel if you work in a university and your strategies keep getting refreshed. We might be having the same conversation in 5 years' time. And I think it's important to reflect on that just in terms of, again, how we move forward. So then we get to film skills and action plan, and there's a big change in language here that I'm sure you guys can get a sense of, even just by the title alone, that we've really moved, as Mark said, kind of from questions of education to kind of questions of employability. And that isn't, I think it's a problem, but I don't think it's necessarily any individual's fault. I think this is just the grand narratives and discourse around government. And in order for government to be pleased with what we're doing here in the UK, certainly, I think it needs to look like this. I don't particularly like it. And we get this sense here of involving the industry. And again, I have a problem with that term because I think industry makes it sound homogenous and monolithic. And there's this thing there and it's very fixed, where actually we know that there are industries, plural. So screen industries might be a more apt approach here. You know, to talk about television, to talk about short film, to talk about independent features, and then kind of big budget mainstream features. God help us to talk about games, to talk about kind of digital activism. You know, there's a lot going on really that I don't think is captured by the moniker industry as a singular. And then they got a 10-point action plan. I don't have time to go through all 10 points here, but you can have a look at the report yourselves. I was kind of struck, I suppose, by this idea of the next generation of workers. So I've highlighted that there because I'm a bit concerned really of that language, because skills then becomes a bit reductive and it becomes about filling kind of perceived or real actually skills gaps at a particular time. I know in the UK at the moment we're struggling in VFX and post-production, for example. So we know that there are those skills gaps. But I think with a lot of inward investment, another question becomes around, for want of a better way of putting it, above the line, talent as well. Where are our next generation of storytellers? And I think storytelling is a skill. I think being able to direct a film is obviously a massive skill, being able to put together a project or manage it. And these are things that don't really fit into skills in the kind of, almost apprenticeship model that I think this is starting to lobby for. So I think we need to be careful when we say the next generation of workers, and we need to be thinking a little bit more about where our, and I'm going to use the term content, which I know some colleagues of mine really hate, but where our next generation of content creators are coming from as well. So the two big problems, I think, moving forward for film education, this has come out of my analysis of this kind of 20-year period, whether or not we can carve out a space for filmmaking education without resorting to economic contribution, or what Mark Fisher calls this notion of a business ontology. It only makes sense if it's either run like a business or it makes some kind of economic contribution. And I say, can we? It's a provocation. I have ideas about this, but I don't think we're there yet. And again, this is an image from Film Skills and Action Plan, because it's nice and comfortable maybe to be able to say you're making the economic contribution. But if we're going back to those older reports and this notion of participating in 21st century life, then we need to go back to that a bit, I think. And secondary to that, we also need to think about the relationship between these reports and the film and television industries, or screen industries, particularly where industrial practice can be questionable. And I've put some case studies here that I mention more in the paper, but you can look at Caldwell's Production Cultures, David Graeber's Bullshit Jobs, and Friedman and Laurison's case studies in The Glass Ceiling. And we see some problematic ways of working. And the reason that these high advocacy reports then become quite problematic, we can see the list of signatories here, who obviously for various reasons want to tell a good story about film, and that's perfectly understandable. But then you get statements like this, that say, film education enables us to sort of respect young people's voices, or the industry to respect their voices. And I have a big problem with that statement, because respect to me would look like kind of easy progression, not easy, but kind of streamlined progression routes into industry, or proper pay. I would suggest those things are respectful, and we know that they don't necessarily exist wholesale. So I think some more work needs to be done around that. And I'll conclude, as I said, with some positives. I did mention BFI and Northern Ireland Screens intervention. Not much has been written about that, but I think it's really seminal, actually. It's crucial that this GCSE and A-level qualification exists only in Northern Ireland at the moment, as far as I know. So that's one thing to bear in mind. And another is the BFI's solo education scheme, the 5 to 19, which was £7 million of funding per year for 4 years to deliver some of the things you see there and help set up their Youth Film Academy network, which persists to this day. So I think I've also put here Goodman's Teaching Youth Media. It's an older text, but it's an interesting case study of youth filmmaking in New York City. So a much more critical pedagogy at work there. Yes, so I think things are possible, very much so. Whether or not we need to do the song and dance and get everyone involved, I'm not sure. I think other more successful ventures may well happen when we don't necessarily publish big reports about them. But I'll leave you there. Thanks very much, everyone.
Fantastic, thank you, Chris. 3 of my favourite books in there. My goodness, yeah. Business ontology. We need more people critiquing the business ontology of culture and education, because there's no other dimension of kind of life and endeavours that it seems that has value apart from producing economic value. And it's maybe something to return to when we have the conversation afterwards. That maybe something like the challenges that have been brought around gender and around race, that maybe they're going to remind us that it's not all about the business. It is also about representation. It's about access. It's about kind of a cultural value.
Mm.
But I'm going to hand over to Becca because she's going to add to our conversation and our sense of young people and their engagement with the world of screen culture and the world of screen industry. Thank you very much, Becca.
Yeah, thank you, Mark and Chris. And I suppose it's a good Flip and Jamie have obviously known what they've been doing with the order that they have placed us in, because I suppose what I'm dealing with in my presentation is how young people are interpreting these public discourses of employability and meritocracy existing within the film industry. But then we know that the reality of that is quite different. And so yeah, probably looking at a different perspective of how young people are kind of digesting these narratives and how that's kind of being reproduced in the choices that they're making and how they perceive careers in the film industry in particular, what they expect to look like, and then actually kind of teasing out whether that might be the kind of reality that they would be coming into. So I just have a few slides, just mostly to keep me on track, because I could probably talk about this all day. But yes, so my paper was on exploring the aspirations of young people to work in the British film industry through 2 comparative focus groups, which might be the longest article title ever, but I'm sure there's longer ones out there. And I just want to begin by giving a bit of background as to why I opened up into this area of research, because I actually have no background in film at all. What I had done before this research and before my role at Glasgow Film Theatre was I actually worked for a number of youth charities. So Gallery of Modern Art, Young Scot and Prince's Trust in Scotland. And a lot of my career was about providing young people with opportunities to explore their employability skills and to develop them. And I had a really formative experience working Gallery of Modern Art because we did a 12-week programme working with harder to reach young people to explore different pathways in the creative industries as a career. But as I moved throughout my employment at Young Scot and Prince's Trust, we were doing a lot of work on careers. And to be honest, it mostly kind of centred around STEM and academic subjects and trades, plumbing, electrician, those kind of things. And it was so stark to me how the creative industries was completely absent from these conversations. And when I was trying to push a creative industries agenda and talk about the wealth of opportunities and activities and experiences that make up a creative industries career, I was often met with a lot of resistance, not just from work colleagues or from the institutions that I work for, but actually from young people themselves. So when I was speaking to young people about creative careers, they would say things like, oh, my mum said not to do that because I'll just end up teaching art as a subject anyway if I do art at uni, or you'll never have a stable career if you go down that path. And I also really began to notice that these experiences were particularly relevant when I was working in or with young people from low or no income families. And the kind of idea of having a stable career and stable career prospects seemed very at odds with having a creative career in any sense. And I've seen some really kind of tragic cases that I carry with me of incredibly smart, incredibly motivated, creative young people being turned away from pursuing a passion because the perceptions that they had around them was that they wouldn't have good career prospects or good university prospects if they pursued that ambition. So that really stuck with me for quite a long time. And in 2017 to 2018, I went to do a master's in education policy at UCL. And through there, I just found some key theorists that just really opened up these observations that I had and started to provide me with a kind of theoretical framework to which to explore this. So some kind of really impactful reading I did was on Bourdieu and the theories of cultural capital and how access to art and culture, or lack of access to art and culture, can really entrench social division and kind of replicate social inequality throughout generations. Stephen Ball, who has lots of theories, but particularly his theories of hot and cold knowledge, which, if you're not familiar with, are absolutely fascinating. So hot knowledge is the knowledge that we get from our friends, our family, people that we speak to directly who have had an experience. So for example, young people are much more likely to speak to their family or their friends about what their careers ambitions are, and that forms their hot knowledge. So what information they get back about their friends and careers. And cold knowledge is things that are objective knowledge that's available. So it might be university prospectus, it might be hearing advice from a careers counsellor, but these are a wee bit more removed from the kind of hot knowledge circle. And Ball theorises that young people, in fact every person, is much more likely to trust the hot knowledge that they receive. And lastly, Louise Archer, who's done a lot of work, particularly on science aspirations and aspirations to work in the STEM, but has really kind of done a lot of exploration on how young people cultivate their aspirations, how family is involved in that process, and how young people operationalise that hot and cold knowledge division, and really interesting reading that kind of helped break this observation that I had down for me. So when preparing to do the research, in all of my work, and indeed still to this day in my work at GFT, I've always thought it's incredibly important to speak to young people directly. I just turned 30 last month, so the age bracket of 15 to 25 is really out with my grasp now. And the world that they live in is completely different to the one that I was at school at. So I think it's always very important when talking about young people's aspirations or talking about what young people think of this, that we are actually speaking directly to young people in a non-patronising way and giving them the opportunity to inform us. I probably could have done some of this research without that, but as Mark pointed out, I think the most interesting parts of the article is when you hear from the young people directly. So one of the challenges that I had at the time was the wonderful Film Education Journal didn't exist, and I had to broaden out kind of the academic research. And as you kind of see in the article, if you've read it, sometimes I've had to revert back to kind of broad policy concepts in the creative industries just as much as within film specifically. And I don't think this was a disadvantage necessarily, because what you'll find in my research is that actually even the young people themselves had a lot of difficulty separating the idea out of being a filmmaker or a film worker and actually just being a creative producer. So they quite themselves often use the term creative career and film industry career very interchangeably and without very little distinction. One of the kind of key challenges was selecting the two schools that I worked with, and I wanted to provide some area of contrast. So I looked at the kind of Guardian Index of Poverty map and selected two different schools from two different local areas. Monroe Academy is in quite high percentile at risk of child poverty, and Douglas High School in very low risk of experiencing child poverty. And that kind of helped inform some of the conversations that we had as a group that you'll see there. Some of the limits of my research, only 2 focus groups. I feel like we could have spent a year doing focus groups and gathered a much greater wealth of information or surveys, but I do think the in-depth conversation that the focus groups allowed was useful. And there was a little bit of disparity in uptake between the groups as well, which meant we heard from some from more voices than others. So some of the key findings, all of the young people that I spoke to all perceived the film industry as a fun and a creative place to work, but they all thought that it would require being flexible, being resilient, being hardworking, and ultimately believed that any success in the film industry would be determined by their own performance. There was no discussion of any structural or societal barriers that might prevent somebody from achieving in the creative industries. Some of that did come out a little bit later, but often they were quite firm in their belief that the meritocracy of the film industry would allow them to overcome any of those barriers, such as access to finance. Finance was discussed as a barrier for some, and I would say this was more greatly discussed in Monroe Academy, where the young people had already experienced some setbacks in pursuing their creative careers. So some of them had been doing their own kind of extracurricular classes, or had been making their own content, and they were already finding that if they didn't have the money to purchase certain equipment, or they didn't have the ability to go on that extra college course that was available, they were already experiencing that barrier. And I would say for Douglas High School, finance was very rarely referred to as a barrier. The main barriers that they perceived would be a lack of their own skills. So if they had an inability to use Photoshop or film editing software, that would be what would create the barrier for them. Secondly, there was a very clear division between going to university or creating your own opportunities. And they often seem to interpret these as being mutually exclusive, which was really interesting. There wasn't this idea that you could kind of combine the two or drop in and out. There was the idea that you would either go to university and university would provide those learning experiences for you, or you would have to create those own learning experiences for yourself. And what I would say is that often going to university, which was the kind of main route that most of the young people said that they wanted to go down, was actually the goal in itself. So when I spoke to the pupils from Douglas High School and I asked them what their career ambition was and what kind of jobs they thought they might be interested in the film industry, all of them said, I would like to go to university to study film and media. So they hadn't even yet articulated whether they were interested in editing or set design or acting or directing. It was mainly interpreted through the idea of, well, once I get to university, that's when it will emerge what part of that course I'm most interested in. And what I would say is another key theme for university was all the pupils I interviewed said that families and school were also quite geared towards the university option. There's a really great quote in the article where one of the young participants says, going to university is handed to you on a plate. And if you want to make your own way or do an apprenticeship or do an alternative route that's not university, then you're very much left to your own devices to seek out that opportunity. So I suppose maybe Beck and the idea of mitigating risk going to university, they perceived as the less risky option. However, interestingly, we didn't think that going to university would necessarily give you a leg up in the industry. There was a kind of quiet acknowledgement that even if they did go to university, they would still start from the bottom rung as a runner in the film industry. So it was interesting to see that actually university had a much more kind of social and value to it than actually a career value necessarily. And finally, just want to, I've already touched on kind of families' role throughout of this and kind of shaping those needs. But one of the things as well was also the creative environment that they had in school. And I've got a great kind of few quotes here on the next page. So the first quotes are from Monroe Academy, where they really experienced a disparity in the creative subjects that were available to them. Their school did not offer drama or media at the level that they wanted to take it at, and so they were all doing STEM. And interestingly, all of those pupils referenced doing extracurricular activities in order to provide themselves with those opportunities. And finally, with Douglas High School here, you see that they felt very much that their creative needs were being met in school. Art and media was giving as much prevalence as academic subjects. And they didn't actually take up extracurriculars because they felt satisfied with that, what they were receiving in school. And I just think that's a really kind of interesting point, I couldn't really answer it in the research, but maybe for one day a longer term, but also just to kind of leave you all with a thought about what different kinds of opportunities these young people are being either prohibited from or creating for themselves, and the different kind of knowledges and understandings that they are creating about their own career paths and how accessible they might be to them further down the line. And finally, what do I do with this research now that I've done it, and how does that influence my work? Well, I completely understand Chris's concerns about the emphasis on employability skills that's taking place at the moment. And if my work's making you any uncomfortable, it sounds a bit neoliberal. I suppose in parts I have to maybe accept that some of it is. But from my experience professionally, if creative careers information is completely absent from the conversation and we don't meet some of those employability requirements, then we may be at risk of doing a disservice to the creative young people out there. So I see as part of my role, as well as providing film education opportunities, is recognising that absence of career information for young people and being an advocate for providing that information, particularly not just to the young people themselves, but to the teachers and families that surround them, you know, and providing new hot knowledge avenues for young people to kind of explore their careers. And also we need to recognise the significant barriers young people face when pursuing a career in film. I would say that the young people who have got to university or who've got to their first job in running in a film set have already overcome quite a lot of the negative perceptions that surround creative or unstable careers. And so actually we have to think about the young people that have not been able to do that. And that's often through a lack of either knowledge or access to networks or learning experiences or funding for equipment or specific training. And we have to identify where those barriers are and look to remove them. Otherwise, I do believe the film industry will remain the place of white privilege in some senses. And finally, we have to provide opportunities for the industry to connect with young people and to recognise the challenges of recruiting in the industry. We are facing skill shortages, as Chris mentioned, in several areas. And often I find that the industry wants to recruit new young people and fresh voices, but has an inability because of these kind of insecure working patterns themselves. It's really difficult to build up an apprenticeship scheme if your production is going to shut down in 6 months. So helping and providing opportunities for industry to speak to young people is something I see as a kind of key part of my role as well, to help redress that balance in careers information. So that was a very whistle-stop tour of the paper and some of the influences behind it and some of the context. So thank you so much for having me at Film Education Journal.
Thank you very, very much, Becca. That's wonderful. I mean, it sets out all of the pain and glory of kind of aspirations to work in, and, you know, dashed dreams and, you know, kind of raised hopes. And the hot and cold notion, I think, is interesting, because I think maybe the emphasis on careers advice and guidance, or desire to inform young people, is around the cold stuff. You know, can we do more, you know, promotional videos, which is what Screen Skills are very good at doing. But actually the work that an organisation like GFT can do in just having young people in conversation and regular contact and immersing themselves in these discourses, that's where they get the confidence and where they learn, and they learn kind of behavioural modes, you know, all of the kind of stuff. It's not really about qualifications, it's not really about hard work and determination. Sometimes it's about the way you dress and about the way you talk and the kind of the language you use. And you don't get that by being shown stuff, you only get it by living it. So there's a whole load of stuff to unpack there, which is kind of fascinating and crucial. But we're going to move on to Ryan for our final presentation. I'm just going to hand over to you, Ryan, and you're going to share the screen.
Okay. Can you see that?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, that's good. Yeah, thanks very much for inviting me to give this paper. This is, this really interesting conversation. So today I'm going to be looking at, I can't seem to get the slides to move on. Seems like it's frozen.
Try again.
Yeah, sorry. They seem like they're not moving. There, that's it. I don't know what happened here. Try again. That's it. Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure what happened there, but anyway, I just wanted to say that I'm looking at 3 short films. So first of all, Sabrina's Bollywood from 2002, Fit Like Dude from 2003, and It's Only a Movie 2005. So these are 3 short films made by teenagers in Scotland, coming up to around 2 decades ago. And so they were all made as part of film workshops, digital film workshops, to encourage kids to start using digital film equipment. And I saw these films at the Moving Image Archive in Glasgow. They're now part of the collection there, because the Film Archive is not just about film, it's also about video and digital video. So what I found intriguing was that when teenagers are given access to equipment, I often get the feeling, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I often get the feeling that workshop leaders want the kids to make kind of personal movies. But what seems to happen is that there's a kind of shift, there's a kind of pull towards making parodies instead. And so I wanted to look into this and try to understand why this might be. So I'll try to unpack all these issues from these 3 films. So first of all, It's Only a Movie. So this film explores the effects of screen violence by reworking famous films such as Fight Club, High Fidelity, and The Matrix. And just to illustrate some of the issues that are raised by these films and how they're so rich in content, I just want to show a quick clip from one of the first scenes in It's Only a Movie.
Welcome, gentlemen. Welcome to Violent Movies. The first rule of violent movies is you do not take them seriously. The second rule of violent movies is you do not take them seriously. Third rule, if someone bleeds or dies, it's not real. The fourth rule is do not let your imagination become disturbed. Fifth rule, watch at your own risk. Sixth rule, what you do in the real world is your own fault. And the 7th and final rule of violent movies is take responsibility for your actions.
What they see on TV or in video games, I would reckon, would probably change their way of looking at things.
No, I think that it could exacerbate what's already there, but I don't believe that it directly affects them. No, I don't.
So this film was made by Strange Boat, who are an Edinburgh production company, Edinburgh-based production company. And to make the film, they had support from First Light, which at the time was one of these UK Film Council schemes, which aimed to help young people make their first films. And during promotional screenings, of It's Only a Movie, they included a promotional postcard which kind of explicitly highlights what they were trying to get at. Are young people's minds being warped by popular culture? A documentary exploring the impact of pop culture on teens' behavior. So these are the areas that I find interesting about these parodies. So while it does provide a parody of films like Fight Club and so on, it also has that kind of educational framework in order to explore these issues. So it opens with a discussion between 2 teenage girls as they're leaving a multiplex cinema, and they're discussing whether if someone commits a crime, can they kind of blame it on a film if they watched the film a week before. And so it's explicitly bringing these ideas that you find in kind of newspapers and television discussions about violence into the fiction of the film itself. But what's also fun about the film is that you get the sense that the teenagers really relish the opportunity to reenact their favorite scenes from American films. So here's a reenactment of Reservoir Dogs with the costumes, and Pulp Fiction. So by recreating these scenes, they get to adopt the mannerisms of the actors and to just kind of have fun with it. The film raises a number of issues, but what I find interesting is that all the films that are parodied, that they are parodying, are American. So this gives the actors the opportunity to try out all these accents and kind of adopt a different persona. And so while I was reading the critical literature around this area, one author whose work I found really fascinating and it kind of really structured a lot of what I ended up doing in my article was Becky Parry's study on film workshops in, I think it was Sheffield. So she also noted that her teenagers or our children enjoyed experimenting with these accents and dialects but she also notes that they were drawing on accents that they experienced in film. So some of the child actors were especially accomplished in their performances. And it's worth noting that Andrew Rothney, who played Tyler Durden in that scene, is now gone on to be a professional actor. He's appeared in TV shows like Victim and Shetland, and he's now a patron of the Scottish Youth Film Foundation. Okay, so the second film I'm looking at is Sabrina's Bollywood. So this was made around just a couple of years before it's only a movie, and it's quite fascinating. It's about a teenage girl from Edinburgh and about her love of Bollywood. And so as she tries to communicate her love of Bollywood, she also performed parodies of dance sequences. So I'd like to show you a clip of one of these because this is, yeah, you get the sense that she really had a good time making this film.
Industry which is so colourful, and I also want to work with Shah Rukh Khan because I always write these stories with him as one of the main characters. Music and songs are very important in Bollywood films. Music directors hold great power in the industry, and so do the playback singers who sing the songs as opposed to the stars themselves. Before the film comes out, the songs are played on the radio as a kind of trailers for the film and become extremely popular in the streets of India. Women in Indian film are usually represented as the main love interest of the hero and pop up in the middle of the song, but nowadays, women are getting a more central role. Men in Indian film are portrayed as action heroes, or as the lover desperate to prove to the world that his love is true.
I think Western people are just looking for
so again, like it's kind of a double address that's going on there. It's like part on the visual side of things, it's she's performing the parodies and having fun with her friends, but at the same time the voiceover is providing a kind of educational reflection on the conventions of Bollywood, and especially in gender roles as well. So as the film goes on, we find out that she's a big fan of Shah Rukh Khan. And it was I think one of my favorite scenes in this film is towards the end when she gets to meet him after a press conference that he held at the Edinburgh International Film Festival. So she gets to ask him a couple of questions and just to talk about her love of Bollywood. And so this film was made as part of Scottish Kids Are Making Movies. So this was set up in 1997 by Mark Cousins and Shona Wood, and I think a lot of the meetings were held at the Film House in Edinburgh. And also interestingly, it seems this film was also partly funded by First Light as well. So there's kind of more general tendencies emerging the more you dig into these films. Other thing that I would like to know is that towards the end of the film, like Sabrina says that she would like to see Bollywood and Hollywood as one big industry, so that you would have Bollywood stars appearing in Hollywood films and Hollywood stars appearing in Bollywood films. So you get the sense that she has quite a global perspective on the film industries. And from a critical point of view, I just like this quote because I think this kind of sums up something of what Sabrina's experiencing, and in the way that she finds her voice by looking to the Indian film industry and adapting its conventions in her own way. So she finds her voice by looking elsewhere, but bringing it back to where she's based in Edinburgh. And thirdly and finally, bit like dudes. So if you're from the Aberdeen area, you might get the in joke, but if not, so fit like is like a Doric expression for how are you? And obviously dude is an American slang. So you get the sense straight away that this is going to be a comedy. So during the film, the actors frequently use Doric words as part of the dialogue. And so you get the sense that this film was made specifically for people who are in Aberdeen who would get this sense of humor. And so there's just some production background. This was part of a big initiative in 2003, led by Aberdeen City Council. Various venues were involved. It's a very 934 young people. It's quite impressive participation rate. So the plot of Fit Like Dude is great. It's a sci-fi comedy, and these aliens visit Aberdeen to find out that the youth are under the control of the Crofter, who brainwashes kids to make them young fogies like him. So here's just some shots from the film. So here's the young Crofter. He's built up to be this figure that controls people through this elaborate speakerphones and voice, like it's just hearing the voice of this deep voice throughout Aberdeen, but it turns out it's just a small boy who's really behind everything. So it's kind of parodying maybe Wizard of Oz in the way that Dorothy discovers that about Oz as well. And so the Crofter enacts keeps his power by torturing people. And here, one of the aliens is being, his face is being shoved into Scotch broth. So it could be argued overall that this story contrasts the excitement of youth-orientated pop culture with the perceived dullness of Scottish culture. You can kind of see this kind of opposition that's being set up in this very short clip that I'll show now, which is really interesting because it's scored to Scottish traditional music.
Their fogies, old before their time, as film buffs and the real teenagers left.
Yeah, so throughout the film, it's kind of a running joke that people say it's a sad day that we left the croft, which I think is a kind of joke about Kailyard traditions in Scottish literature, and about, I think that's why they're using the cabbages at the end on the beach. So so as you saw, it's quite a sophisticated kind of commentary going on in this seemingly innocent, funny comedy film. But what I find interesting, and it just seems like there's a running theme that in this film, the Scottish culture is seen as oppressive because it's owned by the adults, whereas pop culture is liberating because it's owned by the kids themselves. So in the final dance sequence, the alien who's been thrown into a prison joins forces with the fellow prisoners to dance their way out of prison. So they kind of adopt this Brazilian dance, which obviously the young fogies hate. They prefer the traditional Scottish music. But this dance enables them to escape the prison and dance their way on Aberdeen Beach, and the cabbages are thrown out to sea. So everything in the world has been, the totalitarian control by the crofter has been overthrown. So I guess overall, just to bring it to a conclusion, these films are really interesting on a kind of textual level and finding out how they were made. But the central question that I'm often wondering about these films is how much of the film was suggested by the teenagers and how much was suggested by the workshop leaders. It's hard to say. That's kind of a general kind of authorship question, I guess, and it's very difficult in these cases to make any judgments just by looking at the films. But I think I can talk about the themes. I'm on sure ground there. And so you get a sense that in these films, the young people co-opted popular culture in order to assert their identity against what they might perceive as kind of stifling traditions that they're trying to break free from. Therefore, I would argue that parody provides an aesthetic distance from personal expression, which ironically is unexpectedly revealing of teenage attitudes. And so I think I'll just end it there. Yeah, so thanks very much for listening, and here's my contact details if you want to follow up with anything. So thank you.
Fantastic. We've got everybody back on camera. That was wonderful, Ryan. It's always great to see films made by young people, made by anybody, and part of a film education conference, just to remind us. And I'm just going to kick off just because it's the most recent, and you kind of raised that question yourself, Ryan, about when we look at these 3 films made by young people in conditions of kind of creative autonomy, I guess. Well, I'm guessing, and it's the extent to which these are the kind of genuine expressions of a kind of identity and interest and enthusiasm and passions, and whether, because they're all from a kind of previous period, and from a period before film education became obsessed with the film industry, and so if there's anything, any lessons that we can draw from that. I was also good because David Barras from Strange Boat and the Scottish Youth Film Festival is here, and I just wondered if he came on camera, because if he can remember it's only a movie, and what he can remember about the kind of the genesis and the origin of that, and whether it was scripted by adults and the kind of young people took on the roles, or how it came about. David,
that'd be great if David could say something about that.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, yeah.
Yeah, it was entirely...
Oh, lost you. Oh, go on. You dropped out a second. Go on, try.
Yeah, I think I'm going to... Oh, sorry.
Ah, there he is.
So, yeah, that was completely concocted by the young people. It was part of a trilogy of films he made, actually. So one of them was a documentary about bullying. The other was their own fiction about violence, which was called The Master, which was their interpretation of doing a kind of Tarantino-esque film, but in an ancient setting. And then they wanted to do the third one, which was It's Only a Movie, which was the parody stuff. And it was very much the films that they were, as teenagers, obsessed with at that time. So the Fight Clubs, the Matrix, the Donnie Darko, all that stuff. And they took the scenes and they actually tried to replicate them shot for shot. So the scene that Ryan played with the Fight Club thing, with the crack of the knuckles and the wedding ring coming off, that was actually shots that were in that sequence. So even the thing like the camera comes up, they tried to replicate all of that, but then they obviously swapped out the dialogue for stuff that fitted their arguments about where violent movies were and how they thought about violent movies. So yeah, a really good group of young people, very into film and knew exactly what they wanted to do, and we were just there as Strange Boat to help them achieve that. So yeah, it was a great project.
Fantastic. Sweding, I think it was called briefly, that kind of notion of copying frame by frame from Michel Gondry, wasn't it? The Be Kind Rewind film.
Rewind, yeah.
Yeah. So that is just very instructive, I think. This the other thing that leapt out for me, Ryan, from your paper and from your presentation, is the 934 children and young people who were making film over the summer holidays in Aberdeen in 2003. So it kind of plays to some of the things that Chris was saying as well, the kind of disjunction between the very high level kind of strategic sets of presentations and very and kind of bold ambitions that get presented with Prosecco and launched with Prosecco, and how disconnected that is from the things that young people actually do with the moving image and like to do, and whether anybody has a kind of sense of that. If that, I mean, obviously it's a problem, but what do we do about it? Do we, the screen skills or the skills strategy, which was launched in 2017 at the same time as the Screen Skills Survey showed that ethnic minority representation in the screen industries had actually fallen. So they come up with it. Well, we all actually came up with a strategy whose acronym is FFS. That's be careful how you kind of title your projects, your strategy. So just a bit more about the connection or the disconnection between strategic direction and strategic presentation and kind of realities in workshops, all over the UK. If anybody has a comment on that.
I think the evidence is probably pointing to the fact that if we're trying to get kind of more diverse voices involved in film and TV production, and we have kids who have great ideas that are ambitious, that come from a place that none of us, Becca, I was, noting your comment about feeling disconnected already from some of the younger people that you work with. And I feel the same at 33 with some of the grads, with some of the students who come into my degree program. There's a massive gulf there. You wouldn't think it, but there really is. We need to find a kind of, I almost don't want to phrase it like this, but I'm going to try a kind of youth empowerment model where it's like, guys, this is over to you. It's your time now. Which incidentally I think is close enough to the name of our university's new strategy refresh. Now is the time, but something like that says, go and make those films, go and tell those stories, go and bring something out from you. And that's almost the opposite, I think, of a sort of skills-based employability progression route thing, if I'm making any sense there. I could ramble for a while, but I won't. But
Yeah, I really agree with Chris that the most successful projects and activities that we've done at GFT have been ones that have, I don't usually call it young person led, because quite often they come to us with a place where they don't have any knowledge of what it's like to run a film festival. So we call it co-programmed and co-curated, and we try and put the GFT staff on the kind of same level. So it's like, a reciprocal relationship between the organisation and the young people who are giving up their time to participate. But I think sometimes when we pre-prescribe outcomes before projects begin, we can actually limit where those projects can go and the interesting places that they can take us. And there has occasionally been times where we've had to maneuver young people from doing a certain thing that they've wanted to do or had an ambition to do, because we either haven't allowed time for it or it doesn't meet any of the project outcomes, and therefore it could put in jeopardy like future funding or future opportunities. And so I think creating more space to really be responsive to the young people that you have in your room at the time and to letting them kind of take control, we kind of have to have a kind of more structural look at how we are engaging with young people, why we're doing it, when we're doing it, and how we're doing it, I think, rather than kind of approaching with, we need to get to this end goal and we need young people to do it, and through that they will learn X, Y, and Z, because as much as that is useful, it can also be limiting.
You've kind of answered the question that Maureen Haskowitz put in the Q&A about ROCs, the Sarah Gavron. I mean, it's not just the Sarah Gavron film. That's the kind of point of it. It's about the participatory nature of filmmaking like that, as a way of involving young people, and as you know, being able to represent and participate in the stories that are told about them. And whether there's a way of standardizing this kind of approach and kind of immersing them in the cultures they represent. I don't know, Ryan, whether there's anything around the tradition of amateur filmmaking, and kind of it's not quite professionalizing amateur filmmaking, but it's making it's maybe recognizing that there are kind of norms and standards that you have to reach in order to get a wider audience. I don't know whether you've got some sense about that as a that you can answer.
Yeah, I guess I've come to this film through my background in researching amateur films, and what I find fascinating about amateur film is that on the surface you think that you have complete creative freedom to do whatever you want, but as soon as you become part of a kind of creative culture, there are all sorts of norms and expectations that you have to fulfill if you're going to be successful in that environment. So you get prizes for the best holiday film or the best fiction film and so on. So over time, amateurs become more experienced at how to put together films that will satisfy audience expectations. And so I guess that's what I found interesting about moving into teenage movie makers as well, because it's a similar kind of thing. They're trying to reach audiences beyond their family and try to impress people, try to put together things to a certain standard, which is quite difficult. Technically, to put together a film that is technically, will entertain an audience. So I guess that's how I came at it.
If we just back at the Q&A, there's some specific questions that people have raised. Jonathan Root is asking Chris if film education and screen education, the screen industries shouldn't only be discussed in terms of a business ontology. What other language do we have for framing what the value of film education?
I think Jonathan's put art in there, and I think that's a major player. And indeed, it's a bit of a tension that I find, teaching students at Greenwich. I've had students say to me this year, for example, that they feel their creativity was quashed by a kind of sense of over-professionalization. I find that fascinating because I don't ever think I do much of that myself. But to hear that from a student, I thought, oh shit, actually, maybe we're not, because it's risk assessments and health and safety and how to get your film together. And, there's stuff that feels essential to understanding how to do that work. But ultimately, I wonder if we move too far that way and therefore don't do enough of the kind of, you have a voice, you're a creative, make something interesting, just go for it. So I'd say art is one, and I think there's a tension there, one that we should explore more. And I think, communication or a communication method, as the film A 21st Century Literacy Report tried to position it, and indeed we know that the Moving Image Arts GCSE, which I know from the comments is also coming online in Scotland, fantastic. That qualification came out of a digital literacy argument. So I think we can talk about it in that sense as well. And I think if you're going to critically talk about film and filmmaking, you do have to acknowledge its kind of money-making industrial kind of remit and power, and that's where a lot of its history is rooted there. So I don't think you should not talk about that. I just think it's about how we're positioning ourselves when we say to young people, come and get involved in film, this is what it's about.
Moving Image Arts is interesting because you're absolutely right. It came out that it was literacy that opened the door to that, but it then has no connection with literacy at all, which is very refreshing and in some ways quite continental and not very kind of anglophone. It's not a literacy thing; it's an art form thing. So it's counter to this kind of the dominance of literacy and the metaphors all around literacy as being the only way to justify anything. I'm interested in what what you think about the kind of hegemony of story and of storytelling, and how it's a kind of motherhood and apple pie thing that nobody can say anything against story. Everybody has the right to tell their stories. except if you've just written Mein Kampf, so not everybody has the right to tell their story, and not every story is equally kind of valuable, salient, and we have to manage that. So I'm just interested whether, because the BFI is just going to turn itself into a storytelling institute, I think, about your engagement with story and how valuable or not that is as a kind of metaphor. Anybody.
Can I just jump back, Mark, just a tiny little bit and just say that the benefit of the filmmaking process, what we used to call soft skills, and I know what has now been morphed into meta skills, I think do not underestimate that. It's project-based learning. So you've got a group of young people and they have to create a film, but they all have to do different things and they have to work together to achieve that goal. And that is a very useful way to look at it educationally, because I think there's a massive, massive benefit to that in terms of they have to really have a plan and work out that plan and communicate that plan to each other. And there might be costumes to be sourced, there might be locations to be sourced, there might be sets to be built, all that kind of thing. It becomes a project-based learning model, which there's a brilliant documentary which its name escapes me at the minute, but it's about a San Diego school that works on that project-based learning model. And Ken Robinson, the guy who did the famous talk on creativity, is in it, and it's absolutely fantastic. So yeah, I think we should always think about that as well as the film side of things. We should think about it's a project-based learning. It's a process that has benefits to everybody that takes part in it, no matter whether the film is great or not at the end of it.
No, absolutely, and that's always part of the kind of argument, the persuasive argument behind filmmaking as a process that reaches far beyond just the kind of the creation of the product. Absolutely. Andrew's asking Rebecca, I was interested in the students' belief in meritocracy, but you said something about the schools and the kind of the socio-economic kind of levels of advantage or relative disadvantage. But do you know anything about the relationship between the belief in meritocracy and where that comes from? And it's a kind of classic piece of false consciousness, isn't it? The belief in meritocracy.
Yeah, and I think perhaps some of the surprising was just like how deep and really entrenched the belief in meritocracy is, and across all the young people's perspectives. I have to be careful not to speak in absolutes because it was a limited part of research and it was a small sample group. What I would say was Monroe Academy was in an area of higher multiple levels of deprivation than Douglas High School. And what I would say I found was the young people in Monroe Academy had already experienced academic and financial setbacks to pursuing their careers ambitions. And whilst they did believe in meritocracy and they thought meritocracy ultimately would prevail, they did expect or say that they would think there would be more than one setback. So they said, they used the example of Jordan Peele and Get Out, and they were saying, he had to try and try and try. So they thought there would be several setbacks, whereas in Douglas High School, they didn't really talk about finance or kind of economic capital as a barrier. So already there was that kind of disparity. And it was, they thought setbacks would come more like in terms of like not having access to equipment or not having the correct skill. And they were much more of the opinion that once you got into the industry, then it would be okay. And so they didn't perceive any setbacks after that initial point. That was, I think, the main kind of disparity between the two groups and how they perceived meritocracy. But I would say that it was a really deeply ingrained belief for all of them. It was just to what extent they were expected to have those setbacks. And I can't help but draw some kind of links between that and the geography that they were in. I think I would love to do a bigger bit of research in the future, kind of deeper diving into this, because I think it's something that we probably all intuitively know and we all kind of intuitively expect, but whether or not the kind of objective research in that area exists. I mean, it certainly does with Louise Archer's work, and I think, and that's on kind of science, I think it'd be fascinating and really useful to do that on a kind of more creative film industry focus.
And I guess what that tells us, or what that's kind of points to, is the kind of individualization of aspiration, of kind of identity, of participation, and of schooling, of education, and the shift from. There's a guy who I think he's a visiting professor at Edinburgh at Napier called Gert Biester, who talks about the learnification of education, and how education is a kind of social process and a socializing process, a collective endeavor on behalf of the whole society, whereas learning is individualized. It's just about you, and it's about your efforts and about your own progression and your own trajectory. So I'm just wondering whether there's a sense, beyond business ontology and beyond individualized meritocracy, can we think about a kind of social and collective set of purposes behind film and film education? Is that possible? Particularly the moments that we've been through in the last year or so about the need for social change and change in representation. How can we put film education as a kind of social, collaborative and collective cause, rather than just a bunch of people with their own kind of trajectories and kind of aspirations?
I think that's a really great question, Mark, and I suppose I don't have an answer to it, but what I would say from my experiences is that at the point of before any film education intervention, so at the point before they've started the project, or at the point where I've met these young people in our research, but even our own young people that do Glasgow Youth Film Festival, there's already a kind of deep perception that a creative career means an isolated career, that it means a lot of working on your own, that it means a lot of driving your own success. That it means lonely. I think there's an image of you at the editing suite, or you in the studio by yourself. And I think that we have to maybe, I think that's always one of the things young people get surprised about when we do our workshops or activities, is just the amount of people involved in filmmaking projects, even if they are small, and how collaborative they have to be in order to be made or be successful. And I think there's something really about kind of demonstrating that to young people and teachers and families more immediately, as David was saying, their project making learning styles, but we have to do a better job of articulating that to the gatekeepers, to the teachers, to the schools, to the parents, about the kind of wealth of experiences that they're going to get through that collaborative process. Because I think it's something that young people themselves don't come in with any idea that that's what they're going to experience. I think they think they're going to come in and be director of their own film and director of the festival, and the learning of that kind of compromise as well is super important and valuable.
Chris, thanks, Becca.
It's also possibly about consciousness raising, because like you say, there are gaps in knowledge here about what the filmmaking process actually entails and how things are made, but also getting them together to find those commonalities. And I know that's we are talking about filmmaking education here, but we're not really. We're talking about a highly individualized culture. So it's not necessarily about us. We're just a very small part of a much larger puzzle. So you wonder how you go about doing it. I often think, and I know I spoke before we started this panel about teaching some of our film students about some anarchist filmmaking. But actually, when you go back to some of those collectives that have existed historically, and in Britain, the kind of 1970s working film collectives, these things have existed before, and they've grown up around issues that people thought were pertinent at that particular moment. Now, we have everything in place, it seems to me, including the issues of our time, that should allow a kind of cultural revolution along the same lines. But that won't happen as long as kind of young people, and us to an extent, are put into these kind of silos of being individuals who have to carve out a certain thing for us at a certain moment. That it's not about me per se, it's actually about the work, that we want to do in order to highlight this, that, or the other thing. It's a massive ask. I'm not saying that any of this is easy, but I think that's where our sights need to be set if we want to kind of be part of pushing for something like this.
Let's get busy then. Ryan, but did you do you want to add anything to that? Well, David,
yeah,
on the screen.
Yeah, it's just find it interesting that the idea that you can make a film so easily with your camera almost mitigates against the way that films are actually made, because people assume that it's so easy to make a film, but it's easy to like film things that are happening on the street. But it's actually, if you're doing a fiction film or something that's more elaborate, you really have to put a team of people together. And what I like about the filmmaking workshops I was looking at, so they're based in different places in Falkirk and Edinburgh and so on, and Aberdeen, is that you got a sense that those kids at that particular time, as teenagers, before they went to university or anything, they got a sense of what it's like. It's almost like a comparison with sport, the way that sport is really good at encouraging people to play football or basketball or something at a young age, so they get a sense of what it's like and what skills are needed. You get a sense with these film workshops is that people like teenagers are getting a sense of what it's like to make a film. And those skills, some of them will really take to it, and some of them will think it's not for them and they'd rather play football. But I think it's really important to get that experience at a young age, so you're not leaving it until people are getting into their 20s before they experience what the film production process.
Yeah, that was always the thing. That when do you train to become a filmmaker? When you go to the National Film and Television School, which is like waiting to teach poets to read and write until they're 22. It just doesn't make any sense. We're going to have to wind up, and we're right at 12:30. I just wanted to. Joanna has asked a question about qualifications that film educators have, and it's a big question with lots of kind of complex answers, but it's also part of the answer to this bigger question that we've got, which is if we have people the people who work with young people in schools and outside schools, it's about them having the confidence, the knowledge, the skills, and the kind of consciousness, which I think you'd go quite a long way to developing if you read the 3 articles by our speakers. I think it's been a real kind of opening up of a whole range of kind of political and educational issues. It's been fantastic. I hope everybody agrees. So I'm just going to say thank you very, very much to Becca and to Chris and to Ryan, and encourage everybody to read their papers online and Ryan's when it's published, when it comes out later this year, I think. Jamie's also mentioned because of the question about the anarchist collectives, the Folk Film Festival, which again you can find online. That's happening in the next couple of weeks, and is always a fantastic experience. But otherwise, thank you very, very much, everybody. It was great. Cheers.